Well, the EU could have chosen not to react to the US trade sanction. At first sight, the economic effect of the US measures is not so important. The US measures concretely affect EU export worth 6.4 billion euros in 2018, which is a drop in the transatlantic ocean of trade flows. But this case is indeed taken very seriously by the European Union, and in particular by the European Commission, as it threatens to create economic distortions on the international trade of steel and aluminium, with the risk of raising imports from other members, other targeted members such as China. Moreover, the EU approach is also systemic, given the perspective of future US measures based on national security, starting with the automobile, as the US administration recently opened a new investigation on this topic, on those products. From the very beginning, the EU combined a strategy which is diplomatic and also legalistic. In March 2018, the EU Commissioner for Trade decided to negotiate on the steel issue with the US administration. Together with Japan and the US, the EU Commission also accepted to publish a joint statement where they shared, and I quote, the shared objective to address non-market oriented policies and practices that lead to severe overcapacity, create unfair competitive conditions for our workers and businesses, hinder the development and use of innovative technologies, and undermine the proper functioning of the international trade, including where existing rules are not effective. Well, this statement clearly targets China. Meanwhile, at the end of March, the EU launched a safeguard investigation into steel products to prevent trade distortions into the EU. But this rather conciliatory approach wasn't sufficient to prevent the US administration from ending the EU exemption to its trade measure on the 1st of June. The EU struck back with its own trade sanction, which entered into force on June 21. Again, this reaction can be legally assessed both from the EU point of view, the EU law point of view, and from international law perspective. The EU measures are based on two Commission implementing regulations, which are themselves based on a 2014 legislative act. You will see the act, you will have access to the act in the bibliography joint with this communication. Interestingly, for the first time, the EU trade countermeasures are adopted through the so-called comitology procedure, whereas former EU trade sanctions used to be based directly on the treaty, former Article 133, which is now Article 207. It might seem technical, but it's quite interesting indeed, as this comitology procedure has two main advantages. First, the act, the implementing act, does not need to be approved by the European Parliament and the EU Council. It is formally adopted by the EU Commission, and it not only needs approval by member state representative, in practice a committee of national experts in trade issues. Second, the decision-making process is much quicker with comitology. Less than 3 months were necessary to find an agreement on the EU sanctions and the list of targeted products. By contrast, it took more than a year for the EU to agree on sanctions in some WTO cases, such as the FSC case, despite the their authorization of the sanctions by the dispute settlement body of the WTO. The sanctions will be into force as long as the US measures remain applicable. The EU imposes additional tariff duties on a list of US products, which are not limited, of course, to US steel and aluminium. The products have been carefully chosen with two main considerations. First of all, avoid a negative impact on the EU market, in particular on EU consumers or EU industries which are importing US products to transform them and produce new goods. This is clearly said within the implementing regulation itself. Second, the EU chose to target strategic products, taking into account the political and symbolic dimension, I would say. That is why, for instance, oranges produced in the swing state of Florida were chosen and targeted, and also motorcars from the US are clearly Harley-Davidson produced there. Also other products have been chosen with this aim, such as bourbon, peanut butter, which have been added on the list. From the EU point of view, there are few chances that this implementing measure can be successfully challenged before the US court, before the European Court of Justice. It seems perfectly in line with the EU treaties and the power of the Commission. The conformity of those measures with the WTO now. Well, it depends on the legal characterization. That is why the two European implementing regulations insist on the safeguard agreement, considering that the US measures on steel and aluminium must be considered as safeguards. If the US measures were to be justified on the ground of national security, as I said before, the European measures would then be illegal. Last but not the least, together with Norway, Canada, Mexico, India, China, and now Russia, the EU brought a complaint before the WTO. The US administration immediately reacted and strongly criticized the EU measures. In a rather non-diplomatic message, the American USTR, Mr. Lighthizer, recently declared that, and I quote, President Trump has taken actions on trade in steel and aluminium to protect our national security interests. These actions are wholly legitimate and fully justified, both as a matter of US law and WTO rules. By contrast, the European Union has concocted a groundless legal theory to justify immediate tariffs on US export. To be continued. Thank you.